Hey y'all, this is Mindy Strong, and this video is going to talk to you about municipal debt. That's in the investment vehicles section of the Series 65 exam. All right, without further ado, here we go. So, there are characteristics of municipal debt is that this debt is debt issued by state and local governments. Okay, so we talked about the US government debt, and now we're talking about the municipal debt. That's the state and local government debt. That's how they get money for things they need within the state. Now, there is a very easy way to remember the tax implications of these. Because these are issued by the state and local governments, they are exempt from federal tax. Okay, so think of it this way. The state and the local governments take care of this municipal debt. The federal government doesn't really have anything to do with this. They have their own problems. They have their own debt, and they tax their own. Okay, they tax their own. So it is exempt from federal tax, all municipal debt exempt from federal tax, and it is subject to state and local tax. Okay, there are different types of municipal debt based on the length of time. This is common. We have realized that all of these different types of debt, all of these different bonds and bills and notes are different time periods. So, just like the government has different time periods for the debt that they can give out, same thing here for municipal. So, we have serial maturities, which are the long-term issues. They're issued at par, and they pay interest semi-annually. And then there are the short-term notes. They're issued at a discount and mature at par. We also should come to realize that when we're talking about short-term debt, it's generally issued at a discount and matures at par. That's across the board. That's across the board. And we have something called level debt service. That is combined interest and principal remains the same. So think of a mortgage payment. When you make a mortgage payment, at first you're paying mostly interest, right? First few years is mostly interest. That's when people are like, arg, that's so annoying. I'm not even touching my principal. But your monthly payment remains the same. That is level debt service. That is what level debt service is. The payment stays the same, even though the principal and interest percentages within the payment change. Okay. In this section, we're talking about two main types of municipal debt. One is general obligation bonds, and the other is revenue bonds. Real quick, I'm going to give you a good way to differentiate because you will be asked to differentiate. Revenue means money making, right? Revenue bonds make money. So when you are identifying whether something is a general obligation bond or a revenue bond, you ask yourself, does this company make money from whatever they are creating with the money from this bond? And I'll go into more detail with that for you. Okay, but right now we're talking about general obligation bonds. Now, these are backed by the full faith, credit, and taxing power of the issuer. Whoever issues the bond is backing this bond. These are non-self-supporting debts. Local governments generally have one way. There are a couple exceptions, but local governments generally have one way of raising money for themselves, and that's through collecting property taxes. They're called ad valorem taxes. Now, usually these ad valorem taxes are unlimited, meaning they can raise the taxes at any time if they need to pay off the bondholders. They don't need to, they're not limited. They're unlimited in the amount they can raise. Limited tax bonds limit how much tax they can impose. Okay, so let's think about it. These are going to be riskier to the bondholders because there's a limit to the amount they can tax. But these can be sold at a higher interest rate because they're riskier, right? This is a common idea that we need to understand. If something is riskier, you're going to expect more of a reward, but you're going to accept higher risk for that reward. So these are limited, meaning there's a limit, like I said, to how much they can tax. So there's a chance that the bondholders won't get paid if there's not enough money. Whereas with unlimited, they can go, hey man, we need more money to pay these bondholders. We're just going to tax these people more. So there's less risk in the unlimited. Voter approval, however, is required for both limited and unlimited general obligation bonds. Voter approval is required. Okay, so we just talked about local. Now we're going to look at state issues. Generally speaking, states don't have property taxes. Generally speaking, there are a couple of exceptions. But for the most part, in order for states to get money to pay for things, they use income and sales taxes. Income tax, how much money you make, and then sales tax, when you spend money in that state, you are expected to pay a tax on the goods, right? And we know that different states have different income taxes, and different state taxes, sales taxes on things. Okay, makes sense. Now, there is something called a constitutional debt limit, and that is the local limit on how many GO bonds can be outstanding. And voting also must happen to change this limit. Okay, so think of, voting is there to protect us, right? So voting must happen before these limits are increased. And GO bondholders can compel a tax levy or legislative appropriation if default occurs. Okay, so that is their recourse, is they can compel a tax levy or legislative appropriation. Okay, makes sense. Okay, revenue bonds are riskier than GO bonds, therefore they trade at higher yields. So revenue bonds, unlike GO bonds, are self-supporting debt. They are backed by the specified revenues only. So these are the types of bonds that are issued by companies or by any organization that will make money from the construction, from the creation of whatever it is, whether it's a highway, toll, or a new water plant. They are going to make money from building this. Okay? Revenue bonds, but they're self-supporting. So they're only backed specifically by themselves. Now, how do they get that money to pay the debt? Well, operation of the project, fees, rents, grants, excise taxes, which we'll talk about, and more. So they have many different ways to get the money together to pay the debt, basically charging people, charging fees, rents, getting grants, and other taxes. But still, it's self-supporting, so it's riskier. Now, they must do, in order to get this funding, first you must prove that it's going to work, right? If you're going to get bond debt from people and you're going to have your bond holders, you have to prove it's going to work. So they do a feasibility study, and outside consultants do these feasibility studies, so they're not biased, and they have to prove that, yep, this is going to work. This construction's going to work. It is going to make this amount of money. It is going to cost this amount of money. Yes, you can issue these bonds, okay? And there is, along with that, there is a trust indenture. That's their contract. It's the legal requirement to protect the bondholders. a trust indenture. And there's a bond contract. That's the security agreement of the income source or sources to pay the bond holders. And there is the trustee. That person makes sure the contract is being followed, and they have the right to invoke legal action if it's not. Okay, so before a revenue project starts, there's a feasibility study, and then they do have a trust indenture, a bond contract, and a trustee overseeing all of that. But it's riskier than GO bonds because it is just a self-supported debt. So within the trust indenture, this is all pretty obvious. But within the trust indenture, there are a number of covenants. These are promises. So the maintenance covenant or promise is that we will maintain the facility in good repair. The rate covenant or promise is the issuer will maintain fees for use at a high enough rate to cover the debt. So think of tolls, and a toll is created to pay for a new highway. Okay, so they have to promise that the tolls, the amount of traffic that's going to come through here, and the amount we're going to charge, that's our rate covenant, and we promise that this is going to be enough to pay the bondholders. Makes sense? So we can't just charge 25 cents every time someone comes. We got to charge them an arm and a leg. And segregation of funds. We promise to keep the revenue funds separate from our other funds. Books and records covenant. We promise to maintain proper record keeping. No sale covenant. We promise to not sell the facility. And generally that's for a length of time, like until the bonds are paid back. Additional bonds covenant. An earnings test must be met before additional bonds are sold. So let's say they realize, you know what? Oh, we raised a lot of money for this, but we're going to need more. Something happened and prices have gone up. We need additional bonds. And we promise if we ever need those additional bonds, then we're going to do an earnings test, and we're going to make sure that it's going to work out for us before we issue those additional bonds. Insurance covenant, we promise to have insurance in place to pay off the bonds if anything should happen. And catastrophe call covenant, we promise that if this thing is destroyed, that we will call the bonds and pay our bondholders. Okay, these are the trust indenture covenants to make the bondholders feel safer about their riskier investment. And then there's a revenue pledge. This outlines how the issuer will apply the collected revenues. So once we get those revenues in place, or once we get those revenues coming in, this is how we are going to issue them to our bondholders. And there's a net revenue pledge. Basically, the bondholders are going to be paid after only one thing is taken care of, and that's operations and maintenance. Operations and maintenance have to come first. As soon as those are taken care of, the bondholders are going to be paid. That's the net revenue pledge. And then there's the flow of funds, which just illustrates the priority of collecting and distributing these revenues. So first of all, we've got the huge revenue fund. All the gross revenues are in there. And then we have our operations and maintenance fund. And remember, we promised in our trust indenture to keep those separate. So those run the facility. And then we have a sinking fund. And the sinking fund is where we pile all the monies together to meet the debt service requirements. One big pile. The debt service reserve, that's going to be our extra monies to pay the bondholders. The reserve maintenance is the extraordinary maintenance that may have to happen. We've got a separate pot of money for that. And that's where that will go next. Renewal and replacement. Any regularly scheduled major repairs is going to come out of this. And then surplus, we're going to have leftover monies. So this is the flow of funds. And they illustrate that the priority goes to the bondholders after operations and maintenance are paid. So there are different ways, as I said, that revenue bonds can get money and for their bonds. So one of them is through a special tax. And they're also called excise taxes. And they can be put on anything pretty much. But cigarettes, liquor, and gasoline are commonly used for special taxes. So these are used to raise money for revenue bonds, special taxes. There are special assessments, which are different. Special assessment is going to be a tax. So special taxes are placed on anyone that comes to that area and buys liquor or cigarettes or gets gas. Special assessment is very particular in that this is going to be something that a tax that is placed on a local group. So let's say we have 300 houses that surround this park that they're going to create. Well, it doesn't make sense to tax someone that will not benefit from this park, that's not near the park and it's on the other side of town, to pay a tax for the park that's 5 miles away. So this would be a tax placed just on the people, those houses around the park. Same thing with stoplights. It's going to be a local tax just placed on the people that will benefit from that stoplight. Okay, so it's used to help a segment of the population. And that's a cool treehouse, right? I like that treehouse. Anyway, moral obligation bonds. Okay, so this is a type of revenue bond, and the moral obligation bonds work like this. It is backed by a promise to pay. This is a stressful situation. So let's say, remember I'm from Florida, so let's say that Tallahassee, boo, Seminoles, go Gators. But anyway, let's say that Tallahassee has a revenue bond to build a structure and they are failing and they are not able to pay their bondholders. The moral obligation would be that the state of Florida backs and promises to pay that revenue bond. So this is only happens in times of distress, and it's basically the big guy coming in to help the little guy. These are very high risk, obviously, but they're only utilized if they have to be. And that's a moral obligation. The state of Florida has a moral obligation to support Tallahassee in this example. And then we have double-barreled. So basically they're backed in two ways. These bonds are backed by the revenue bond itself and the faith, credit, and taxing power of the municipal issuer. Usually this is backed by an ad valorem tax. So it's the revenue bond, but then it's also backed by a taxing power, double-barreled. So those are obviously not as risky, right? Okay. There comes a time when in situations in which debt is retired, that means it's paid off. And there are ways in which it's paid off. One of them is called a mandatory redemption. So think of putting all of the bonds that are owed to the different people in a box. The issuer is required on a set schedule to call certain bonds to pay them off. So the bonds to be called are going to be chosen at random. So they're all in that box, and then somebody closes their eyes and they reach their hand in and they grab and they say, okay, we're going to pay these. Well, as those bonds are paid off, you've got less bonds in there, and those bonds that remain become more valuable. Mandatory redemption, they have to do this. They have to do this. There's a set schedule. And then the opposite of mandatory is optional. So optional redemption, see the picture of the calendar. So we're still talking about time, but this is having the right to call bonds after a certain date. Usually they're called at a premium, but they're not required to do this. If they're called at a premium, that means they're going to be more expensive to call. But they have the right to do this. They are not required to do so. Okay? And then we have extraordinary, optional, so we're still talking about optional, redemption. So there are special cases that give an issuer the option to call early. So let's say you've got a mortgage bond and people have been paying their mortgages on time and early, and you have the ability to pay these bonds back early. Guess what? Boom, paid. It's an optional redemption. And then they can issue new bonds, or maybe they're done with their project. Then there's an extraordinary, so extraordinary, not common, right? Not common. Extraordinary mandatory redemption. Let's say that bonds are issued to pay for the construction of something and that project is canceled. Well, then you have to call the bonds back. You have to pay the people because you're not even using the money. That would be an extraordinary mandatory redemption. Extraordinary, not common. Both of these are not common. One is optional, one is mandatory. Okay. Refunding. Okay. That is when you issue new bonds and you retire old bonds. So there's advance refunding. New bond interest payments are used to pay on the old debt. New bond interest payments are used to pay on the old debt. And there's defeasance, that is eliminating GO debt as a liability, and it's also known as escrow to maturity. Okay, defeasance. So you're eliminating the general obligation bond as a liability, also known as being escrowed to maturity. Then there's IRS arbitration regulations. So this is a regulation on arbitrage that an excess of interest earned under these taxable investments is limited, because you don't want people going crazy with the arbitrage. So excess of interest earned under the taxable investments is limited. Okay, it's limited. Then you have tender, also known as a put option. The bondholder can put the bond to the issuer after a certain date. So they can basically say, hey man, you have to take this out. You have to take this back. You have to pay me after a certain date. So the bondholder has that option. And then there's a tender offer. The issuer has the option to retire the debt early by making an offer. So there's a tender put option. Basically you say, hey, I'm done holding on to this. You got to give me my money back. And there's a tender offer. The issuer says, hey, I'm going to go ahead and retire this debt early and make you an offer. Okay. Tax status of municipal debt interest. Remember, this is exempt from federal but not state unless it's purchased by a state resident, which can be exempt from state and local tax. So that's pretty cool. If someone is living in Alaska and they get a municipal bond and it states that they don't have to pay state and local tax, well, it's already free of federal tax, so hoo-dee-hoo, that person doesn't have to pay tax on that. Very cool. And they'd be happy about living in Alaska. Capital gains, however, are taxable and capital losses are deductible. Makes sense. You're making money on your money. That is going to be taxable, and capital losses will be deductible because you're losing money on your money. However, there is an exception to this whole taxable at the state and local levels. Territories and possessions of the U.S. are completely tax exempt. So congratulations to Puerto Rico and Guam for that. Okay, so here's kind of a summary way to remember the tax status, because this is a little bit tricky. So, municipal debt is exempt from federal tax, not state. We know this. Let's look at these different options. So you've got treasury or agency debt. So we're talking about the government debt. The government debt is federally taxed. Okay, so think of that as federal bonds. They tax their own. You are exempt from state and local. Municipal bonds, remember, these are state and locally issued. They tax their own. So they're exempt from federal. Federal has nothing to do with them, but state and local can tax them unless they are a resident of that state. And then we have corporate bonds. They can be taxed on every single level, federal, state, and local. Okay, so they tax their own, remember that. And then corporate bonds, they're not issued by the state. They're not issued by the government, so everybody is going to tax them. Got it. Okay, that's the end of municipal debt section. Hope this has been helpful. And if it has, let me know what has been helpful. And why don't you go ahead and subscribe so you can see more of my videos. Have a great day.